It was the silence after they left that always told the truest story. My son, Robert, and his wife, Cynthia, had a way of filling a house not with warmth but with noise. Their voices were a little too loud, their laughter a little too sharp. They moved through my rooms with the proprietary air of people who believe they are inheriting the space, not just visiting it. They brought with them the scent of expensive perfume that clung to my velvet armchair long after they were gone, a cloying sweetness that was nothing like the jasmine that grew on my porch. This last visit had been for my 75th birthday. A milestone, they called it. They brought a cake from a bakery I did not like, its frosting stiff and tasting of chemicals. They brought a gift, a cashmere shawl in a beige color they called oatmeal, a color for a woman who was fading into the background. I accepted it all with the practiced grace of a mother who has long since learned that the gift is never for you, but for the giver's peace of mind. They stayed for precisely 2 hours, long enough to take the requisite photographs for their social media. My face nestled between their smiling, taut ones, long enough to ask perfunctory questions about my health without waiting for the answers, long enough for Cynthia to wander into my bedroom, a place she knew was my sanctuary. I heard the small click of the jewelry box on my dresser. It was a sound I knew intimately. The box was rosewood, a gift from my late husband James on our 10th anniversary. Inside, nestled on faded black velvet, were the few good things I owned. My mother's pearls, a pair of diamond earrings he'd given me when Robert was born, and his watch. It was a simple timepiece, a gold-plated Omega from the 60s. Its face was worn, the leather strap cracked and softened with decades of use. It wasn't worth a fortune in money, but it was the single most valuable thing I possessed. James had been wearing it the day he died. I had slipped it from his still wrist myself before the men from the funeral home arrived. His ticking had stopped years ago, but in my mind it held the last seconds of his life. It was his time captured forever. Cynthia came out of the bedroom, a bright false smile plastered on her face. She was holding it. Her manicured fingers, tipped in a garish shade of red, were wrapped around the delicate gold casing. It looked small and fragile in her grasp. "Eleanor," she'd said, her voice like honey laced with glass. "I was just admiring this again. It's so wonderfully vintage." I said nothing. I just watched her. "You know," she continued, her eyes darting to Robert, seeking his silent approval, "our little Jamie is developing a real interest in classic things. He's so much like his grandfather Jamie. Their son was 12. His interests, as far as I knew, extended to video games and expensive sneakers. He had met his grandfather twice as a baby. He would not remember the man, let alone share his interests." Robert nodded, playing his part. "He is a real old soul." "I was thinking," Cynthia said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, as if we were girls sharing a secret, "I could borrow it, just for a little while. I want to get it cleaned, maybe a new strap. We could give it to Jamie when he's older." A piece of his heritage, the word borrow hung in the air. It was a thief's word, dressed up in family clothes. You do not borrow the heart of a memory. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands, resting in my lap, felt cold and heavy. I looked at my son, at Robert. My boy. The child I had rocked to sleep, whose fevers I had cooled with damp cloths, whose future I had prayed for on my knees every night. I looked for a flicker of protest, a hint of his father's integrity in his eyes. I found nothing. Just a placid emptiness, a willingness to let his wife lead. "He would be so honored," Robert added, his voice hollow. I could not find my own voice. It was trapped somewhere deep in my chest, behind a wall of grief and disbelief that was 40 years in the making. This was not the first cut, merely the deepest. Cynthia took my silence as consent. Of course she did. My silence had always meant consent to them. It was the foundation upon which they had built their convenient relationship with me. I was the quiet mother, the agreeable grandmother, the one who baked the pies, watched the children, and never ever complained. "Wonderful," she chirped, slipping the watch into her designer handbag. The bag probably cost 10 times what the watch was worth on the open market. The snap of the clasp was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "He'll be so thrilled. We really must be going. Traffic will be a nightmare." They kissed my cheek. Their lips were dry. They gathered their things, their movements brisk and efficient. They were already gone, in their minds, Their duty was done. The old woman had been visited. The heirloom had been secured. I walked them to the door. I stood on the porch, the oatmeal-colored shawl draped over my shoulders, and watched their silver luxury car pull away from the curb, leaving a cloud of exhaust in the late afternoon air. The scent of it mingled with my jasmine of violation. I stood there until the sound of their engine faded completely, until the only sound was the distant hum of the city and the ticking of the grandfather clock in my hallway. That clock had been a wedding gift from James's parents. It had marked every minute of my married life. Every joy, every sorrow, ticked on indifferent, a steady metronomic beat measuring the moments of my life. Tick, tock. I went back inside and closed the door. The click of the latch was soft, but it felt final. The house was blessedly silent again. But this silence was different. It was heavier. It was filled with the space where the watch used to be. I walked into my bedroom and stood before the dresser. I opened the rosewood box. The empty indentation in the velvet was like a fresh wound, a hollow space where a heart should be. I traced the shape of it with my finger. The velvet was worn smooth from decades of holding its treasure. I had spent a lifetime accommodating. I had accommodated their schedules, their tastes, their children's needs, their casual cruelties. I had made myself smaller and smaller to fit into the cramped spaces they allotted for me in their lives. I was a Sunday phone call, a holiday dinner reservation, a convenient, unpaid babysitter. I remembered the Christmas they told me not to bring my sweet potato pie because their friends were on some new diet, and the kids didn't eat old-fashioned stuff. I brought it anyway. It sat on the counter untouched, until I wrapped it back up and took it home. I ate a slice alone in my kitchen that night, the taste of cinnamon and memory thick in my mouth. It was the best pie I had ever made. And I realized sitting there that I had not made it for them at all. I had made it for myself. A small act of defiance. I remembered Robert calling to tell me they had sold their first house and moved to a bigger one in a better school district. He told me 3 weeks after it happened. It was just so hectic, Mom. You know how it is. I knew he had called his wife's mother from the moving truck. I remembered the family vacation to Hawaii, the one I only learned about when Cynthia posted the pictures online. My grandson, Jamie, grinning in front of a volcano. There was a comment from one of her friends beneath the photo. "Where's Robert's mom?" Cynthia had replied with a string of happy emojis. Someone had to stay home and hold down the fort. She loves her peace and quiet. My peace and quiet had been weaponized against me. My independence, which I had guarded so fiercely after James died, had been rebranded as a desire for isolation. It was easier for them that way. If I wanted to be alone, then they were not guilty of leaving me alone. This theft, and it was a theft no matter what pretty word she put on it, was different. It was not about my cooking or my time or my presence. It was about James. It was an erasure. They were taking his memory and reshaping it to fit their narrative, to create a heritage for their son that they had not earned. They were stealing his story. I stood there in the quiet of my bedroom for a very long time. The grandfather clock chimed the hour. 6 o'clock. The house was growing dark. I did not turn on a light. I stood in the gathering shadows and I let the hurt wash over me. It was a cold, familiar tide. I had been swimming in it for years. But then something else rose to the surface. It was not anger. Anger is a hot, messy thing. This was cold. It was clear. It was a single hard point of light in the darkness. It was a decision. My hands did not tremble. Not yet. I closed the lid of the empty jewelry box. The soft click echoed the snap of Cynthia's handbag. One sound had been a taking. The other was a closing. I walked into the kitchen. The chemical-smelling cake sat on the counter, a garish pink and white monument to their thoughtlessness. I picked it up, plate and all, and walked it to the outside garbage can. I dropped it inside. It landed with a dull, satisfying thud. I did not feel wasteful. I felt clean. Back inside, I filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove. I spooned loose-leaf black tea into my favorite pot, the one with the small blue flowers that James had bought me from a little shop on a trip to the coast. The ritual was a comfort. The whistle of the kettle. The steam warming my face. The dark swirl as the water hit the leaves. I sat at my kitchen table with my cup of tea. No milk. No sugar. Just the clean, bitter taste. I looked at the photograph on the refrigerator, The one they had insisted on taking an hour ago. My face, small and tired, squeezed between their two large predatory smiles. I got up, took the picture off the refrigerator, and slid it into a drawer. The one where I keep the manuals for old appliances and expired coupons. The junk drawer. Felt right. The decision was not a storm. It was a quiet alignment, like a bone setting back into place. It was the realization that I had been pouring my love, my time, my legacy, into a leaking vessel. And I was done. I was simply done. The grandfather clock ticked. The tea was warm in my hands. The house was silent. But for the first time in a very long time, it did not feel empty. Felt like my own. The next morning I woke before the sun. This was my habit, a holdover from the years of getting Robert ready for school and James off to work. For the past 20 years since James's death, it had become a time of quiet reflection. A time to sit with a cup of chicory coffee and watch the world outside my window slowly come into focus. But this morning was different. There was no reflection. There was only purpose. The clarity from the night before had not faded with sleep. It had solidified. It felt like a steel rod running down my spine. I did not turn on the radio to listen to the gospel station as I usually did. I did not want the comfort of hymns. I wanted the clarity of silence. I sat at my kitchen table and made a list. I have always been a list maker. It's how I organize the world. Grocery lists. Things to pack for a trip. Christmas card recipients. My lists were the scaffolding of my life. This list was different. It was not about building something. It was about dismantling it. The paper was a crisp, clean sheet from a legal pad. The pen was a good one, black ink, a smooth, steady flow. My penmanship, once praised by the nuns at my school, was still strong. 1. Call Mr. Collins. 2. Bank. 3. Safe deposit box. 4. The house. Just 4 items. The 4 pillars of the life I had built with James. The life that was supposed to be a foundation for our son. Mr. Collins had been our lawyer for 30 years. He had drawn up our first wills when Robert was a baby. He had handled the probate when James passed. He was a good man, a quiet, respectful man who smelled of old paper and peppermint. He was semi-retired now, but I knew he still took calls from his old clients. He was from a generation that understood loyalty. I waited until precisely 9 o'clock to call him. Not a minute before. Punctuality, my father used to say, is a form of respect. His secretary, a woman named Joan who had been with him since the beginning, answered on the second ring. Mr. Collins's office. Joan, this is Eleanor Vance. How are you this morning? Her voice warmed immediately. Eleanor. It's so good to hear your voice. I am well, thank you. And you? I am well, thank you. I was hoping I might be able to have a word with Mr. Collins. At his convenience, of course. Of course, Eleanor. Let me see. He's in today. He has an opening at 11, if that's not too soon for you. 11 would be perfect, I said. Thank you, Joan. We'll see you then, dear. I hung up the phone. The first step was taken. It had been easier than I expected. Just a simple phone call. But it felt momentous. Next, the bank. I dressed carefully. Not in my usual house dress, but in a navy blue suit I had not worn since James's funeral. I put on my mother's pearls. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror on the back of my closet door. I saw a woman I barely recognized. She looked older, yes, the lines on her face deeper than she remembered. But her eyes were clear. She looked formidable. The thought surprised me. I had never thought of myself as formidable. Patient, yes. Enduring, certainly. But formidable? It felt like putting on a new coat, one that fit surprisingly well. The bank was downtown, a cold marble building that always made me feel small. Today I did not feel small. I walked across the polished floor, my sensible heels clicking with a steady, determined rhythm. I had several accounts. A checking account for my daily expenses, a savings account, and a series of investment accounts that held the bulk of the money James had left me. He had been a careful, clever man with his money, a mechanic by trade. He had invested in property long before this city became a desirable place to live. He had bought 2 small apartment buildings in a neighborhood that was once considered rough. Now it was filled with trendy restaurants and young professionals. The rent from those buildings, managed by a property company, was more than enough to live on. Combined with his life insurance and other investments, it was a considerable sum. A multi-million-dollar estate. Robert was on my checking account. We had set it up that way after James died. "Just in case, Mom," he had said. "In case you need me to pay some bills for you." It had seemed sensible at the time. A practical measure. Now, it felt like a vulnerability. A back door I had left unlocked. I sat down with a young woman whose nameplate read Brenda. She had bright pink fingernails and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How can I help you today, Mrs. Vance?" "I would like to remove my son, Robert Vance, from my checking account," I said. My voice was even. Calm. Brenda's smile faltered for a second. She tapped at her keyboard. "Okay. We can certainly do that. Is there a particular reason?" "I no longer require his assistance with my finances," I said. The words were formal, cold. They were a shield. "Of course," she said, recovering. She printed out a form. "I'll just need your signature here and here." I signed my name. The ink was a dark, definitive line on the page. "And," I added, pushing the signed form back across the desk, "I would like to close my safe deposit box." This gave her another pause. "Close it? Are you sure? You've had that box for a very long time." "I am sure the safe deposit box held our important papers. The deed to the house. The titles to the cars long since sold. Our marriage certificate. Our wills. And the paperwork for the trust. The James and Eleanor Vance Family Trust." A sour-faced man in a cheap suit led me into the vault. The air was cold and still. He used his key, then I used mine. The small metal door swung open. He slid the long, heavy box out and placed it on a table in a small, private viewing room. He left, closing the door behind him. I lifted the lid. Everything was in perfect order. James had been a man who believed in order. The documents were all in labeled manila folders. I took out the thickest one. Vance Family Trust. The trust was the heart of everything. It was designed to protect the assets and pass them on to the next generation. The sole beneficiary upon my death was Robert. And if something happened to Robert, everything would go to his son Jamie. My grandson. Cynthia's son. I put the folder in my large handbag. I took our marriage certificate as well. The rest, the old car titles, the birth certificates, the social security cards, I left. They were just paper. The trust document was the power. I walked out of the vault, handed the empty box to the man, and signed another form to relinquish it. As I walked back across the marble floor, I felt lighter. I had reclaimed my name from an account. I had reclaimed our legacy from a metal box. My appointment with Mr. Collins was next. His office was in one of the older buildings downtown with a real elevator operator, an old man named George who remembered my name. The office itself had not changed in 30 years. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs worn soft with age, and the quiet, steady ticking of a mantel clock. It was a comforting space, a place of stability. Mr. Collins stood up when I walked in. He was thinner now, his hair completely white, but his eyes were still sharp and kind behind his spectacles. "Eleanor, it is a pleasure to see you. Please sit." I sat in the chair opposite his large mahogany desk. The same chair I had sat in when we signed the original trust documents. A young Robert playing with toy cars on the floor at my feet. The memory was so vivid it was painful. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. I took the trust document out of my handbag and placed it on the desk between us. "I want to change this," I said. He looked at the document, then back at me. He did not look surprised. He simply nodded, a slow, thoughtful gesture. "All right. Tell me what you have in mind," and so I did. I told him everything. Not the emotional parts. Not about the pie or the vacation or the casual neglect. I did not speak of my hurt. I spoke of the facts. I told him I wanted to restructure my entire estate. I told him I wanted to create a new trust. I told him I wanted to change the beneficiaries. "I want to be very clear," I said, my voice as steady as the ticking clock on his mantel. "My son, Robert, and his son, James Vance, Jr., are to be explicitly and completely removed. I want a new trust in my name alone. The Eleanor Vance Trust." Mr. Collins listened without interruption. He made a few notes on a yellow legal pad. His penmanship was a weak, spidery scrawl, but his mind was as sharp as ever. When I was finished, he looked at me over the top of his glasses. "This is a significant change, Eleanor. I am aware," I said. "Your son, he will likely contest this. He may claim undue influence, or that you are not of sound mind." A small, bitter laugh escaped me. It was a dry, rusty sound. "He has not been concerned with the state of my mind for many years. Let him try. My mind has never been more sound. As for influence, the only person influencing this decision is my son himself. And his wife." I told him about the watch. I described it in detail. The worn gold, the cracked leather. I told him what Cynthia had said. Borrowing it for Jamie. Mr. Collins listened, his expression unchanging. But I saw something in his eyes. A flicker of understanding. A flicker of something that looked like pity but was closer to respect. He was, after all, a man of James's generation. He understood the meaning of such things. A man's watch was not just a piece of jewelry. It was his time. His legacy. "I see," he said when I had finished. The two words were heavy with meaning. He understood completely. "So," I said, leaning forward slightly, "can it be done?" He tapped his pen on the desk. "Yes, Eleanor. Can be done. A revocable trust can be amended at any time by the grantor. That's you. We will dissolve the old trust and create a new one. We will retitle all the assets, the brokerage accounts, the deeds to the properties, into the name of the new trust. It will be a clean break. Airtight." "Good," I said. "We will need a new beneficiary," he prompted gently. "I have one in mind," I said. "But I need to speak with her first." "Of course," he made another note. "There is one other thing. The house. It's in the trust. What do you want to do about the house?" I looked out the window at the city below. The house was the last pillar. The place where I had raised my son. The place where I had loved my husband. The place where I had planned to live out the rest of my days. "I'm going to sell it," I said. The words came out easily with no hesitation. The decision had been made before I even spoke it aloud. The house was full of ghosts. I was ready to let them go. Mr. Collins nodded. "I can recommend a good realtor. A woman I trust." "Thank you," I said. We talked for another hour going over the details. The properties, the investments. He would need a full accounting. He would draft the new documents. He would need me to come back in a week to sign them. When I left his office, the sun was high in the sky. The city seemed brighter. I felt a sense of purpose I had not felt in years. I was not just a widow. I was not just a mother. I was Eleanor Vance. And I was taking my life back. On the drive home, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I turned off the familiar gospel station. I scanned the dial until I found a station playing the blues. The raw, honest sound of a guitar and a mournful voice filled my car. It was the music James had loved. It was music that didn't pretend everything was all right. It was music that understood pain. And for the first time, I felt like I could listen to it without crying. I just listened. And I drove. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, methodical purpose. I started with the house. Each room was a chapter of my life, and it was time to close the book. I began in the attic, the repository of forgotten things. There were boxes of Robert's schoolwork, report cards with gold stars, crayon drawings of our family, him as a stick figure holding my hand. I remembered the pride I felt, the fierce, all-consuming love for this small person I had created. I looked at the drawings, at the childish scrawl that said, "I love Mommy, where did that boy go? When did he become the man who stood by and let his wife steal his father's memory?" I did not linger on the question. It was a rabbit hole of pain I had no desire to fall down. I took the boxes one by one and piled them in the garage. For him. He could come and get them, or he could let them be thrown away. The choice would be his. It was his childhood, not mine. I had lived it once. I did not need to keep it stored in my attic. I found my wedding dress, wrapped in blue tissue paper that had yellowed with age. I lifted the lid of the box. The lace was still beautiful. I remembered James's face when he saw me walking down the aisle of our small church. The look in his eyes.
Pure, unadulterated joy.
That memory was not in the box. It was in my heart. I closed the lid. This I would keep. Not for what it was, but for what it represented. Promise made and kept. I worked my way down through the house. I was not sentimental. I was a curator deciding what was essential to the next chapter of my life. I sorted things into 3 piles. Keep, donate, discard. The keep pile was surprisingly small. My books. My gardening tools. The worn velvet armchair where James used to sit and read the paper. My mother's pearls. A handful of photographs. The good quilt my grandmother had made. Its stitches tiny and perfect. The donate pile was large. Clothes I hadn't worn in years. Dishes for a family of 12. Linens for beds that were always empty. I called the women's shelter downtown, the one my church supported. They were grateful. They sent a truck the next day. I watched as 2 young men loaded up the pieces of my old life. Felt good. Felt like making space. The discard pile was for the things that held no joy, only obligation. The oatmeal-colored shawl. Every gift Cynthia had ever given me. Framed photos of Robert and his family from their sterile professional photo shoots. I took the photos out of the frames and tore them into small pieces before putting them in the trash. It was a quiet, satisfying act. During this time my phone would ring. I'd see Robert's name or Cynthia's on the caller ID. I never answered. I let the calls go to the answering machine. The first message was from Robert, 2 days after my birthday. His voice was laced with a vague, impatient concern. Hey Mom. Just calling to check in. You were quiet the other day. Hope everything's okay. Call me back. It was a command, not a request. An item on his to-do list. Call Mom check. I deleted it. A week later another message. This time from Cynthia. Her voice was syrupy sweet.
Eleanor, E.
I was just thinking about you. I hope you're enjoying that beautiful shawl. I took James's watch to a wonderful jeweler. A real artist. He's going to make it look brand new. Jamie is just going to be over the moon. Anyway, Robert said you haven't been answering. We're getting a little worried. Give us a call, honey. Make it look brand new. The words were a desecration. The value of the watch was in its age, in its wear. In the small scratches on the crystal that were a map of my husband's life. She didn't understand. She would never understand. I deleted the message. I did not feel anger. I felt a profound sense of confirmation. I had made the right decision. The silence was my answer. It was the only language they would understand. For years my words had been meaningless to them. My opinions, my feelings, my desires. They had washed over them, leaving no trace. But my silence? My absence? That they would notice. Because it created a void where my compliance used to be. Created work for them. They would have to wonder. They would have to call again. The balance of power was shifting. Their calls became more frequent. More insistent. Robert's tone shifted from impatience to irritation. Mom, seriously, what is going on? I'm your son. You can't just ignore me. This is ridiculous. Call me. Now he was right. He was my son. But the title of son is not a deed of ownership. It is a relationship. And relationships are a two-way street. He had been driving the wrong way for a very long time. I continued my work. I met with the realtor Mr. Collins had recommended. Her name was Sarah. She was a sharp, kind woman with a no-nonsense attitude I appreciated. She walked through the house with me. It's a wonderful home, she said, her eyes taking in the good bones of the place, the hardwood floors, the crown molding. So much character. But it's a lot of house for one person. It is, I agreed. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had fed my family for 40 years, and I signed the papers to list it for sale. Sarah told me it would sell quickly. The market was strong. The day she put the for sale sign in my front yard was a strange one. I watched from the window as she hammered it into the lawn where Robert had learned to play catch. It felt like a betrayal and a liberation all at once. An end and a beginning. That afternoon, I got the call I had been waiting for. It was not from Robert. It was from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to the machine, but something told me to answer. Hello. There was a pause. Then a young woman's voice, hesitant. Grandma? Is that you? It was Ally. Ally was Robert's daughter from his first marriage. He had married young, a foolish, passionate mistake with a woman he barely knew. It had ended in a bitter divorce when Ally was just a toddler. Robert had quickly moved on, meeting Cynthia a year later. Ally had been raised by her mother in another state. I saw her only sporadically. A week in the summer. Few days at Christmas. Cynthia had never liked Ally. She saw her as a loose thread, a messy reminder of her husband's past. As Ally grew older, the visits became less frequent. Robert allowed the distance to grow. It was easier for him. It kept the peace in his new perfect life. But I had never forgotten her. I sent her birthday cards with a $20 bill tucked inside. I called her on holidays. We had a quiet, fragile connection, a bond forged in the spaces Robert and Cynthia had left empty. Ally, I said, my voice thick with surprise and emotion. My dear girl. How are you? I'm okay, Grandma. But I'm worried about you. Why is that? Dad called me, she said, and I could hear the discomfort in her voice. He never calls me. He said you weren't answering your phone. He said you were being difficult. He wanted to know if I had heard from you. And what did you tell him? I told him I hadn't. But then he said something weird. He said Cynthia was just trying to do something nice for Jamie with Grandpa's watch, and you got upset. I closed my eyes. So that was the narrative they were spinning. That I was a petty, sentimental old woman having a tantrum. Grandma, Ally's voice was soft, careful. She took Grandpa's watch? The question was direct. There was no judgment in it. Only a search for the truth. In that moment I knew I had been right to wait, to hope. Yes, dear, I said. She did. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then I heard her take a sharp breath. Oh, Grandma. I am so sorry. The words were like a balm on a wound I didn't know was still so raw. 2 simple words. I'm sorry, not from the people who had wronged me, but from this young woman who was almost a stranger. But she was family. Not by convenience but by blood. By a shared history they were trying to erase. She was James's granddaughter. She had his eyes. It was his favorite thing, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I remember him showing it to me once. He let me listen to the ticking. He told me it was the sound of time moving forward. Tears pricked my eyes. She remembered. Someone remembered. He did say that, I said, my voice catching. What she did, it was wrong, Ally said, and now her voice was firm, filled with an indignation that I had not allowed myself to feel. It wasn't hers to take. We talked for an hour. I told her everything. Not just about the watch but about the years of small cuts. The forgotten birthdays. The casual dismissals. I had never spoken these things aloud to anyone. Saying them to her felt like lancing a wound, letting the poison out. She listened. She truly listened. She didn't offer solutions or excuses. She just made small sounds of understanding, of empathy. She saw me. What are you going to do? She asked when I was done. I'm making some changes, I said simply. Good, she said with no hesitation. Good for you then, a different note in her voice. A hint of sadness. There's a for sale sign in your yard. I saw it online. Are you really selling the house? I am. Oh, I always loved that house. The way the sun came in through the kitchen window in the morning. The smell of your roses. She remembered the details. The small important things. Ally, I said, the decision forming as I spoke the words. Would you be willing to come for a visit? Soon? There's something I need to discuss with you. In person? I can be on a plane tomorrow, she said. When I hung up the phone, the house felt different again. The silence was no longer just my own. It was filled with the promise of a friendly voice, a kindred spirit, an ally. I walked to the mantelpiece and looked at the photographs there. James and I on our wedding day. Robert as a gap-toothed little boy. And a small faded picture of a 5-year-old Ally, sitting on her grandfather's lap, her small hand covering his as he held out his wrist, showing her the watch. Her face was a study in concentration. His a mask of pure adoration. The legacy wasn't dead. It had just been waiting for the rightful heir. Ally arrived the next afternoon. I watched from the front window as the taxi pulled up. She got out, a single worn backpack slung over her shoulder. She was 21 now, a young woman, but I could still see the little girl from the photograph in her face. She had James's thoughtful eyes and his calm, steady way of moving. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just looking at the house, at the for sale sign in the yard. I saw her shoulders slump just a little. I opened the door before she had a chance to ring the bell. "Hello, dear," I said. Her face broke into a real genuine smile. She closed the distance between us in 3 long strides and wrapped her arms around me. She was tall and strong. Her hug was not the brittle, air-filled embrace of Cynthia. It was solid, real. "Hi, Grandma," she murmured into my hair. "It's so good to see you." "It's good to see you too," I said, patting her back.
Come in, come in.
"You must be tired." I had made her a cup of tea and set out a plate of the simple butter cookies she had always loved as a child. She sat at the kitchen table, in the spot where the morning sun streamed in, and she looked around the room. I could see her taking in the empty spaces on the walls where pictures used to hang, the neat stacks of boxes in the corner. "It looks so different," she said softly. "I'm paring down," I said. "Getting rid of the things I don't need anymore." She nodded, her eyes full of understanding. She knew I wasn't just talking about furniture. We didn't speak of her father or Cynthia. Not at first. We talked about her. She was in her final year of college studying archival history. She wanted to work in a museum, preserving old things, telling their stories. It was so perfectly, wonderfully her. Of course she would be the one who understood the story of a watch. "Grandpa would have been so proud of you," I told her, and I knew it was true. James had been a man who revered history, who believed that the past had lessons for the present. "I think about him a lot," she confessed, stirring her tea. "I don't have many memories of him, but the ones I do are so clear. He taught me how to skip stones at the lake. He always smelled like sawdust and coffee, and he told me stories as she spoke. I felt a deep, abiding peace settle over me. My decision was not just right, it was preordained. It was a course correction, putting the family back on its proper path. That evening, after a simple dinner of soup and cornbread, I took her into my study. I had the new trust documents, drafted by Mr. Collins, laid out on James's old desk. "Ally," I said, my voice serious, "I asked you here because I need to talk to you about the future. My future. And yours." I told her everything. I explained the original trust, how it was set up to pass everything from James and me to Robert, and then to his son. I explained the value of the estate, the properties, the investments. I saw her eyes widen slightly as I spoke of the numbers. She had no idea. Robert had never treated me like a woman of means, so why would she think otherwise? Then I pushed the new document across the desk towards her. "The Eleanor Vance Trust." "I have made a change," I said. "I have dissolved the old trust. This is the new one. It contains everything. The house once it's sold. The buildings. The entire estate." She looked at the cover page, then up at me, her expression confused. "Okay. I want you to read the section on beneficiaries," I said, pointing to a tab page. She opened the thick document and began to read. I watched her face. I saw her brow furrow in concentration, then her eyes scanned the page again, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her lips parted slightly. She looked up at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Grandma, I don't understand." It says I'm the primary beneficiary. For everything." "That's right," I said calmly. "But what about Dad? What about Jamie? Your father and his son have been provided for their entire lives," I said, my voice even and firm. "They have a beautiful home. They have every comfort. They do not need my money. What they needed was my respect, and they threw it away. This," I tapped the document, "is not about money, Ally. It is about legacy. A legacy is not just wealth. It is story. It is memory. It is character. Your father has shown no interest in the true legacy of this family. You have." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "But it's too much. It is a responsibility," I corrected her gently. "It is the responsibility to take what your grandfather and I built and do good with it. To live a life of integrity. To remember the stories. Can you do that?" A single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. She nodded, unable to speak. "There are conditions," I continued, my voice softer now. "A portion of the estate will go to my church, and another to the women's shelter. And I have stipulated that a fund be set up for your education, should you choose to pursue a graduate degree. The rest will be yours to manage and grow when I am gone. But none of it, under any circumstances, is to go to your father or to Cynthia's son. I had been specific with Mr. Collins. The disinheritance clause was, as he'd put it, ironclad. It named them specifically and stated that the exclusion was intentional and not the result of an oversight. Grandma, she finally whispered, finding her voice, are you sure? I have never been more sure of anything in my life, I said. The next day we went to Mr. Collins's office together. Ally sat beside me, silent and observant, as I signed the final documents. The weight of the pen felt good in my hand. Each signature was a declaration. My name Eleanor Vance over and over again. Not Mrs. James Vance. Not Robert's mother. Just me. My will. My legacy. My choice. When it was done, Mr. Collins shook my hand, then Ally's. You have a wise and formidable grandmother, he said to her. Ally just nodded, her eyes still wide with the enormity of it all. That weekend the house sold. A young family, a doctor and a teacher with 2 small children, made an offer well over the asking price. They wrote me a letter, telling me how they fell in love with the garden, how they could picture their children growing up in the sunny rooms. I accepted their offer immediately. The thought of the house being filled with laughter again brought me a surprising sense of peace. Ally helped me with the final packing. We went through old photo albums together. She listened enraptured, as I told her the stories behind the pictures. Stories of her grandfather as a young man, of my parents, of a life her father had never bothered to ask about. We were not just packing boxes. We were weaving the tapestry of her inheritance, thread by thread. The inevitable confrontation came a week before the closing. I was watering the jasmine on the front porch when their silver car pulled up to the curb. They got out, Robert and Cynthia, their faces grim. They had clearly seen the sold sign that now covered the for sale sign. They marched up the walkway. Cynthia was in the lead, her face a mask of pinched fury. Robert trailed behind her, his expression a mixture of confusion and resentment. Mom, Robert started, his voice strained. What is going on? A sold sign? You're selling the house without even telling me. It is my house to sell, Robert, I said calmly, setting down my watering can. I did not invite them in. I remained on the porch, a step above them. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. Your house, Cynthia scoffed, stepping forward. This is the family home. This is Jamie's heritage. You can't just sell it. I can, I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. And I have. Why are you doing this? Robert demanded, his voice rising. Why are you shutting us out? We've been worried sick. Have you? I asked, looking him directly in the eye. Or have you been annoyed? Have you been inconvenienced by my failure to answer your summons? He had the grace to look away, flustered. Cynthia, however, had no such shame. This is about that stupid watch, isn't it? I cannot believe you are being so petty. I was doing a nice thing. I had it restored for Jamie. She opened her handbag and pulled it out. The watch. It was horribly, terribly wrong. The old, worn face had been polished to a brilliant, cheap-looking shine. The cracked leather strap had been replaced with a shiny, new one that looked like plastic. It was a caricature. A soulless replica of the thing I had loved. She had not restored it. She had erased it. You see, she said, holding it out as if it were a trophy. It's beautiful. Perfect for him. I looked at the gleaming, ruined thing in her hand. And then I looked at her. And for the first time I did not feel hurt. I felt nothing but a vast, empty pity for her. For her inability to see. You took my husband's watch from my bedroom without my permission, Cynthia, I said, my voice low and steady. Every word was a carefully placed stone. You took it, you destroyed it, and you call that a nice thing. You believe you have the right to take any part of my life, any part of my history, and remake it to suit your own purposes. You are mistaken. I turned my gaze to my son. And you. You stood there and you let her. You stood in your father's house and you watched his memory be stolen. And you said nothing. You have been saying nothing for 20 years. Robert's face was pale. Mom, that's not fair. Fair? I interrupted. And this time there was a note of steel in my voice that silenced him. Fair was the life your father and I gave you. Fair was the love and support and opportunity we provided. You have taken that fairness and treated it like a blank check. The account is now closed. Ally, who had heard the car, appeared in the doorway behind me. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, a silent, supportive presence at my back. Cynthia's eyes narrowed when she saw her. What is she doing here? Did you call her? This is a family matter. Ally is family, I said. She is here because I invited her. This is my home and she is my guest. You are not. The finality in my voice was unmistakable. This was the end of the conversation. Robert looked from me to Ally, a dawning horror on his face as some small piece of the truth began to penetrate his self-absorption. What have you done? He whispered. I have taken control of my own life, I said. Something I should have done a long time ago. Now I have things to do. You should go. I turned without another word and walked back into the house. Ally stood aside to let me pass. Then she closed the heavy oak door. The click of the latch was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I did not stay to listen to what they said or did next. It no longer concerned me. The final weeks in the house were a blur of activity, but it was a peaceful, productive blur. Ally was my shadow, my helper, my confidant. We found a small, beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet building across town, one with a large balcony perfect for my roses and gardenias. It was less than a third the size of the house and it felt like a blessing. It was all the space I needed. Moving day was surprisingly easy. The things I had chosen to keep fit perfectly into the new space. The velvet armchair sat by a large window. My grandmother's quilt was folded at the end of my bed. The photos of James and of a young Ally on his lap were given places of honor. My new home felt like me. It was not burdened by the ghosts of who I used to be, or who others expected me to be. It was simply the home of Eleanor Vance. Ally stayed with me for the first week, helping me settle in. We developed a new routine. Coffee on the balcony in the mornings. Walks in the nearby park in the afternoons. Quiet evenings spent reading or listening to the old blues records I had kept. It was a simple, companionable existence. It was peace. On her last day, she helped me write 2 letters. One to my church and one to the women's shelter, informing them of the bequests I had made in their names. It was important to me that they knew. It made it real. When it was time for her to leave for the airport, she hugged me tightly at the door. Thank you, Grandma, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Not for the but for this. For letting me be a part of your story. You were always a part of it, dear. I told her. You just needed to find your page. After she left, the new apartment was quiet. But it was a good quiet. A clean silence. It was the sound of my own life, ticking along at its own pace. A month later, a letter arrived. It was addressed in Robert's handwriting. It was the first communication I'd had from him since the day on the porch. I recognized the weak penmanship of a disappointing son. I did not open it. I placed it on the small table by the door. Sat there for days. I would see it when I came and went. At first it was a source of anxiety, a final loose thread. But as the days passed, my feelings about it changed. I realized the letter itself didn't matter. What mattered was my relationship to it. It was no longer a summons I was obligated to answer. It was just a piece of paper. It held no power over me. Whether it contained an apology, a demand, or a threat, the contents were irrelevant. The choice to read it and the choice of how to respond was entirely mine. My new life is quiet. It is small. It is my own. I have my garden on the balcony. I have my books. I have my weekly phone calls with Ally. I volunteer at the church library twice a week. I have made a new friend, another widow in my building named Martha. We drink tea and do crossword puzzles together. I am not lonely. I was lonelier in my big house, waiting for phone calls that never came, for a respect that was never offered. The other day I was sitting on my balcony, pruning a rose bush when I thought about the watch. Cynthia still has it, I assume. I imagine it sitting in Jamie's drawer. A shiny, meaningless object. Maybe he'll wear it one day. Maybe he'll lose it. It doesn't matter. They thought they were stealing a piece of my husband's legacy, but they were wrong. James's legacy was not in a piece of metal and glass. It was in the kindness he showed others. It was in the integrity with which he lived his life. It was in the love he gave me. A love that made me strong enough, even after all these years, to save myself. That is the legacy I have passed on to Ally. That is the inheritance that matters. The letter from my son is still on the table. Perhaps I will read it one day. Or perhaps I will throw it away unopened. I haven't decided yet. For the first time in a very long time I am not waiting. I am living. And I have all the time in the world.